Ralph continued to blow short, penetrating blasts. The children who came along the beach, singly or in twos, leapt into visibility when they crossed the line from heat haze to nearer sand. Even while he blew, Ralph noticed the last pair of bodies that reached the platform above, a flat, fluttering patch of black. The two boys, bullet-headed and with hair like tow, flung themselves down and lay grinning and panting at Ralph like dogs. They were twins, and the eye was shocked and incredulous at such cheery duplication. Piggy bent his flashing glasses to them and could be heard between the blasts repeating their names: Sam, Eric, Sam, Eric. At last, Ralph ceased to blow and sat there, the conch trailing from one hand, his head bowed on his knees. As the echoes died away, so did the laughter, and there was silence. Within the diamond haze of the beach, something dark was fumbling along. Ralph saw it first and watched till the intentness of his gaze drew all eyes that way. Then the creature stepped from mirage onto clear sand, and they saw that the darkness was not all shadow, but mostly clothing. The creature was a party of boys marching approximately in step in two parallel lines and dressed in strangely eccentric clothing. Each boy wore a square black cap with a silver badge on it. Their bodies from throat to ankle were hidden by black cloaks which bore a long silver cross on the left breast, and each neck was finished off with a ham bone frill. The boy who controlled them was dressed in the same way, though his cap badge was golden. When his party was about 10 yards from the platform, he shouted an order, and they halted, gasping, sweating, swaying in the fierce light. Came forward, vaulted onto the platform with his cloak flying, and peered into what to him was almost complete darkness. Where's the man with the trumpet? Ralph, sensing his sun blindness, answered him. There's no man with a trumpet, only me. Inside the floating cloak, he was tall, thin, and bony, and his hair was red beneath the black cap. His face was crumpled and freckled and ugly without silliness. Out of his face stared two light blue eyes, frustrated now and turning or ready to turn to anger. Is there a man here? Ralph spoke to his back. No, we're having a meeting. Come and join in. The group of cloaked boys began to scatter from clothesline. The tall boy shouted at them. Choir, stand still. Wearily obedient, the choir huddled into line and stood there, swaying in the sun. Nonetheless, some began to protest faintly. Aren't there any grown-ups? No. Meridew sat down on a trunk and looked round the circle. And we'll have to look after ourselves. Secure on the other side of Ralph, Piggy spoke timidly. That's why Ralph made a meeting, so as we can decide what to do. We'd better all have names, said Ralph. So I'm Ralph. We got most names, said Piggy. Got 'em just now. Kids' names, said Meridew. Why should I be Jack? I'm Meridew. Ralph turned to him quickly. This was the voice of one who knew his own mind. Then, went on Piggy, that boy, I forget. You're talking too much, said Jack Meridew. Shut up, fatty. Laughter arose. It's not Patty, cried Ralph. His real name's Piggy. Piggy! Oh, Piggy! A storm of laughter arose, and even the tiniest child joined in. For the moment, the boys were a closed circuit of sympathy with Piggy outside. He went very pink, bowed his head, and cleaned his glasses again. Finally, the laughter died away, and the naming continued. There was Maurice, next in size among the choir boys to Jack, but broad and grinning all the time. There was a slight furtive boy, whom no one knew, who kept to himself with an inner intensity of avoidance and secrecy. He muttered that his name was Roger, and was silent again. Bill, Robert, Harold, Henry, the choir boy who had fainted, sat up against a palm trunk, smiled pallidly at Ralph, and said that his name was Simon. Jack spoke. We've got to decide about being rescued. There was a buzz. One of the small boys, Henry, said that he wanted to go home. Shut up, said Ralph absently. He lifted the conch. Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things. A chief. I ought to be chief, said Jack with simple arrogance, because I'm chapter chorister and head boy. I can sing C sharp. Another buzz. Well, then, said Jack, He hesitated. The dark boy, Roger, stirred at last and spoke up. Let's have a vote. Yes, vote for Chief. Let's vote. His toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. Jack started to protest, but the clamor changed from the general wish for a chief to an election by acclaim of Ralph himself. None of the boys could have found good reason for this. What intelligence had been shown was traceable to Piggy, while the most obvious leader was Jack. But there was a stillness about Ralph as he sat that marked him out. There was his size and attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was the song. Him, with the shell. Ralph! Ralph! Let him be chief with the trumpet thing. Ralph raised a hand for silence. All right, who wants Jack for chief? With dreary obedience, the choir raised their hands. Who wants me? Every hand outside the choir except Piggy's was raised immediately. Then Piggy, too, raised his hand grudgingly into the air. Ralph counted. I'm chief, then. The circle of boys broke into applause, and even the choir applauded, and the freckles on Jack's face disappeared under a blush of mortification. He started up, then changed his mind and sat down again while the air rang. Ralph looked at him, eager to offer something. The choir belongs to you, of course. They could be the army or hunters. They can be, what do you want them to be? Hunters. Jack and Ralph smiled at each other with shy liking. The rest began to talk eagerly. Jack stood up. All right, choir, take off your togs. As if released from class, the choir boys stood up, prattled, piled their black cloaks on the grass. I tried to get over that hill to see if there was water all around, but your shell called us. Ralph smiled and held up the conch for silence. Listen, everybody, I've got to have time to think things out. I can't decide what to do straight off. Everybody must stay around here and wait and not go away. 3 of us, if we take more, we'd get all mixed and lose each other. 3 of us will go on an expedition and find out. I'll go, and Jack, and he looked around the circle of eager faces. There was no lack of boys to choose from. And Simon. The boys around Simon giggled, and he stood up, laughing a little. Now that the pallor of his faint was over, he was a skinny, vivid little boy with a glance coming up from under a hut of straight hair that hung down black and coarse. He nodded at Ralph. I'll come. And I. Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife and clouded it into a trunk. The buzz rose and died away. He stirred. I'll come. Ralph turned to him. You're no good on a job like this. All the same, we don't want you, said Jack flatly. 3's enough. Piggy's glasses flashed. Ralph, Jack, and Simon jumped off the platform and walked along the sand past the bathing pool. Piggy hung bumbling behind them. Piggy's glasses were misted again, this time with humiliation. You told him. After what I said. What on earth are you talking about? About being called Piggy. I said I didn't care as long as they didn't call me Piggy. And I said not to tell. And then you went and said straight out. Stillness descended on them. Ralph, looking with more understanding at Piggy, saw that he was hurt and crushed. He hovered between the 2 courses of apology or further insult. Better Piggy than Fatty, he said at last with the directness of genuine leadership. And anyway, I'm sorry if you feel like that. Now go back, Piggy, and take names. That's your job. So long. He turned and raced after the other 2. Piggy stood, and the rose of indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. He went back to the platform. Come on, said Jack presently. We're explorers. We'll go to the end of the island, said Ralph, and look round the corner. Now, toward the end of the afternoon, the mirages were settling a little. They found the end of the island. We shan't see round this corner, said Jack, because there isn't one. Only a slow curve. And you can see the rocks get worse. Ralph shaded his eyes and followed the jagged outline of the crags up toward the mountain. This part of the beach was nearer the mountain than any other that they had seen. We'll try climbing the mountain from here, he said. I should think this is the easiest way. There's less of that jungly stuff and more pink rock. Come on. The 3 boys began to scramble up. Some unknown force had wrenched and shattered these cubes so that they lay askew, often piled diminishingly on each other. The most usual feature of the rock was a pink cliff surmounted by a skewed block, and that again surmounted, and that again, till the pinkness became a stack of balanced rock projecting through the loop fantasy of the forest creepers. Where the pink cliffs rose out of the ground, there were often narrow tracks winding upwards. They could edge along them deep in the plant world, their faces to the rock. What made this track? Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his face. Ralph stood by him, breathless. Men? Jack shook his head. Animals. Ralph peered into the darkness under the trees, and the forest minutely vibrated. Come on. The difficulty was not the steep ascent around the shoulders of rock, but the occasional plunges through the undergrowth to get to the next path. This is real exploring, said Jack. I bet nobody's been here before. The pink granite of the next cliff was further back from the creepers and trees so that they could trot up the path. This again led into more open forest so that they had a glimpse of the spread sea. Look, look! High over this end of the island, the shattered rocks lifted up their stacks and chimneys. This one, against which Jack leaned, moved with a grating sound when they pushed. Come on! But not come on to the top. The assault on the summit must wait while the three boys accepted this challenge. The rock was as large as a small motor car. Heave! Sway back and forth, catch the rhythm. Heave! Increase the swing of the pendulum. Increase, increase. Come up and bear against the point of furthest balance. Increase, increase. Heave! Great Rock loitered, poised on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leapt droning through the air, and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Echoes and birds flew. White and pink dust floated. The forest further down shook as it passed an enraged monster. And then the island was still. Wacko! Like a bomb. The way to the top was easy after that. As they reached the last stretch, Ralph stopped. They had guessed before that this was an island, clambering among the pink rocks, with the sea on either side and the tides there. They had known by some instinct that the sea lay on every side, but there seemed something more fitting in leaving the last word till they stood on the top and could see a circular horizon of water. Ralph turned to the others. This belongs to us. The boys surveyed all this, then looked out to sea. Jack pointed down. That's where we landed. Beyond falls and cliffs, there was a gash visible in the trees. There were the splintered trunks and then the drag, leaving only a fringe of palm between the scar and the sea. There, too, jutting into the lagoon, was the platform, with insect-like figures moving near it. Come on, said Ralph. We found out what we wanted to know. They scrambled down a rock slope. They were in the beginnings of the thick forest, plonking with weary feet on a track when they heard the noises, squeakings, and the hard strike of hoofs on a path. As they pushed forward, the squeaking increased till it became a frenzy. They found a piglet caught in a curtain of creepers, throwing itself at the elastic traces in all the madness of extreme terror. Its voice was thin, needle-sharp, and insistent. The three boys rushed forward, and Jack drew his knife again with a flourish. He raised his arm in the air. There came a pause, a hiatus. The pig continued to scream, and the creepers to jerk, and the blade continued to flash at the end of a bony arm. The pause was only long enough for them to understand what an enormity the downward stroke would be. Then the piglet tore loose from the creepers and scurried into the undergrowth. They were left looking at each other in the place of terror. Jack's face was white under the freckles. He noticed that he still held the knife aloft and brought his arm down, replacing the blade in the sheath. Then they all three laughed ashamedly and began to climb back to the track. I was choosing a place, said Jack. I was just waiting for a moment to decide where to stab him. You should stick a pig, said Ralph fiercely. They always talk about sticking a pig. You cut a pig's throat to let the blood out, said Jack. Otherwise, you can't eat the meat. Why didn't you? They knew very well why he hadn't. Because of the enormity of the knife descending and cutting into living flesh. Because of the unbearable blood. I was going to, said Jack. He was ahead of them, and they could not see his face. I was choosing a place. Next time. He snatched his knife out of the sheath and slammed it into a tree trunk. Next time, there would be no mercy. He looked round fiercely, daring them to contradict. Then they broke out into the sunlight, and for a while they were busy finding and devouring food as they moved down the scar toward the platform and the meeting.